In your opinion, what can £30 buy today? A satisfying meal at McDonald's for two, a week's worth of groceries in a shopping cart. How about a few cups of coffee at Starbucks? In England today, £30 is often just small change. And for this 57-year-old man, £30 is no longer a consumer comparison. It's a survival limit.
So what did you eat yesterday?
I had fish fingers and beans.
What else did you have?
That's it. That's all I had, was fish fingers and beans for me evening meal. On average, £30 for the month. That's for food, washing, because I have to use a laundrette to do my washing. And
So
that's expensive. No.
Don't eat out, not meeting friends, do not travel unless absolutely necessary. Every day I only dare to eat one meal, and even that meal has to be calculated like a life or death decision, as every penny spent brings with it worries about tomorrow. Poverty in Britain is not just about lacking money, but about lacking choices. You spend hours calculating, filling out support applications, waiting for approval, and worrying about having your benefits cut just because of a small change in income. Escaping poverty isn't like a step forward. It's more like a gamble. And when every effort to improve your life risks costing you more than you gain, poverty in Britain begins to resemble a full-time job, an unpaid job with no future and very difficult to quit. We know that good work is the best way out of poverty. That was the official statement of the British government to Parliament as it faced the growing poverty crisis. Immediately following that sentence is a series of technical maneuvers that sound very procedural: encouraging work, raising the standard of good work, improving income, and then hoping the hands of the clock of life will turn towards stability. The problem is, the story of the working poor begins right at the moment that sentence ends. Because if going to work is a path, then why do more and more people who step onto that path feel like they're running on a treadmill? My legs were still running, even faster than ever, yet everything seemed to stand still, even go backward. Britain, once sold as a land of opportunity, now sometimes functions like an endurance test. You're not allowed to fall, but you're also not given the chance to progress faster. Before turning this into an argument about who cares for whom and who is lazy, let's look at the numbers. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation estimates that over 1/5 of the population in the UK lives in poverty, equivalent to 14.4 million people. That is, it's equal to the total population of London, plus Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, and Liverpool. There's still not enough room to squeeze everything in. Of course, there would be no debate if the cause was unemployment or laziness. But the irony of this story is the fact that, even with a job, they are still poor. In other words, poverty is not outside the labor market. It's right in the middle of the time clock and going to work. Sounds paradoxical, doesn't it? But that is gradually becoming the new normal for the UK.
Yeah, I wouldn't have enough food.
Is there anything more you can do?
No, nothing more I can do. Unless I win the lottery, or get another job.
A third job?
A third job.
And so a very law-abiding class emerged. The working poor people who work but are poor. You still contribute to GDP, still paying taxes, still complying with the law. But the classic reward for labor, a stable standard of living, is increasingly something that must be booked with a certain kind of capital that the poor do not have. Reserve capital. And if you still hope that a stable job and a steady salary are enough to buy a secure life. Let's see if you're lucky enough to win the lottery. When a country that once considered labor a path to social stability now sees working poor emerge as a sustainable class, opportunity is no longer a story of upward mobility. It turned into a balancing act. You're not trying to go up anymore, you're trying not to slide down. Each month that passes is not a step forward, but a successful escape. Ironically, when you're poor, you often don't have a cushion. No cushion means 1 month out of sync, a few days sick. Reduced working hours, Increased bills is the beginning of falling behind. Late payments incur penalty fees. Fines lead to debt. Debt makes the next month worse than the previous one. And so, poverty is no longer a temporary setback. It becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. The harder you try to keep things from breaking, the more you're forced to pay extra just to keep existing. JRF's figures show how deep that hole is. In 2022/23, approximately 6 million people fell into very deep poverty, meaning their income was very far below the poverty line. And, in the context of rising living costs, 72% of the poorest households have had to cut back on essentials like heating or clothing, while 58% report they don't have enough money to buy food. And as the majority of the poor are forced to go hungry, turn off their heating, and cut back on the most basic necessities. Escaping poverty is no longer about a few extra pennies. It's too big a leap, especially when you're standing on the edge of a deep chasm of bills and debts. Of course, this is not the only factor that makes poverty sustainable, but it's the gateway to the loop. If you feel that working to escape poverty is sometimes just a self-congratulatory slogan, you can subscribe to the channel to continue following this analysis, because right after the once poor, always poor cycle comes the real door that locks life away: rented housing. If you're not the type who enjoys a nomadic, adventurous lifestyle, start with something you can't cut back on, like skipping a meal, a roof over your head. In the UK today, housing is no longer just a place to come home to. It's like a toll gate placed right in front of every effort, and the irony is, you can't go around. You can change supermarket labels, change bus routes, and change dinner into instant noodles, but you can't turn the need for a place to sleep into a lifestyle choice. The government might repeat the old saying, going to work is the way out. And theoretically, that sentence sounds very reasonable. But housing often responds with a different logic. Okay, so pay the rent in advance. When rent becomes a pay-before-you-live expense, every story about self-reliance immediately turns into a purely mathematical problem. How much of your budget is locked in from the very beginning of the month? Not a few people lost their homes simply because the landlord wanted the property back, and they couldn't find anywhere below what they could afford. It sounds like a personal situation until you realize it's a common feeling in the rental market. Like an elevator where the down button works great, but the up button sometimes requires a magnetic card that you were never given. Meanwhile, rent and mortgage payments are fixed expenses, and the income of workers is becoming less and less fixed in the sense that life requires. Working hours may be cut, the vessel may be changed, the contract can be unstable. And when you live in a structure where variable income has to bear increasing fixed costs, you're no longer building a life. You're keeping it from collapsing 1 month at a time, like propping up a house with termite-eaten wooden beams. What's more uncomfortable is poverty, because housing is often difficult to see on the books. On paper, you might not be poor if you only look at income. But after the rent money is gone, what's left is sometimes only enough to survive by the standards of a precarious life. This is also why measurement frameworks like the minimum income standard become important. They force people to look at the most difficult question, not how much do you earn, but after paying for unavoidable things, what do you have left to live like a normal human being? From there, housing triggered a chain of effects without exaggeration. When rent increases, people look for places further away. Further means more travel, more expense, more time, and time in working life is also a kind of money. When houses are cheaper, they are often smaller, damper, and less insulated, and energy bills don't necessarily decrease. Health also doesn't decline gently, but rather through prolonged illnesses. Being sick means taking time off work. Taking time off means lost income. Lost income means rent becomes a risk. And so, home is no longer a place to recover, but a place where you must constantly be on the defensive. The market might call it self-correcting. Renters often call it a loop. The more you try to escape a loop, the more it reminds you that the condition for escape is having something you don't have financial cushion. Not everyone falls at the same time, but many people live with the feeling that if they miss a beat for just 1 month, everything will start to slip away. Therefore, when you hear people say, "This country is hollowing out from within," sometimes they are not talking about ideology or patriotism, they're talking about something very real, the standard of living being eroded by rent. The debt here isn't planned debt, like borrowing to buy a house and telling yourself it's an investment. It's also not the kind of cute installment plan that makes life a little more enjoyable. The debt in this story is debt to keep life from falling into freefall. I mentioned in the previous section, when a 57-year-old man was left with only £30 for the entire month after paying rent and bills, £30 not for eating frugally, but for everything else an adult needs to survive in a modern society. With that £30, you have to cover food, toiletries, soap, phone, transportation, and even the unexpected expenses that life always throws at you just when you're at your weakest. Life doesn't have the habit of asking beforehand, and bills certainly don't. Cost of living thus gradually becomes the cost of survival. Expenses that don't help you live better, don't move you forward, and don't even stabilize you in the conventional sense. They just help you not get knocked out of your normal rhythm of life. The internet is no longer a convenience, it's a passport to keeping your job. A phone is no longer an option. It's how others can still reach you. Commuting is no longer a cost of going to work. It's the admission fee for you to continue selling your labor. Even clean clothes come at a price. And when the budget is already tight, those small amounts suddenly feel as heavy as stone. Then debt does something very sophisticated. It turns the future into a resource to burn for the present. You borrow to pay the bills, but the bill next month didn't disappear. It comes back, often with a more professional veneer, late fees, interest, and a cold reminder that society's payment system runs on time no matter if you're struggling to catch your breath. Debt makes you feel like you're running on a treadmill, running really fast just to stay in place. And sometimes, staying still is a great stroke of luck. What makes poverty start to feel like a full-time job is this. You're not just working to earn money, you're also working to manage the lack of it. You are constantly calculating which payments can be late and which will incur penalties, what needs to be paid in advance to avoid greater pain, and what can be postponed without causing a disaster. You don't spend according to your needs, you spend according to the danger level of each bill. And when you live like that long enough, the first thing you lose isn't just money, but the right to choose. Debt locks in the ability to change direction. It's difficult to move because a deposit is needed. Difficult to change jobs because the transition period always carries income risk. And difficult to study further because everything is put on hold to pay off the debt first. You didn't choose the better one. You choose the lesser of two evils while still in pain. That's why this section isn't just about debt. It's about the moment when life becomes incredibly fragile, when there's no cushion left. Life only needs a gentle touch. One illness, one missed shift, one broken down car, and everything falls apart quickly and very silently. There's a very orderly illusion that life only goes off the rails when you do something wrong. But in Britain today, sometimes you don't need to do anything wrong. You just need to live long enough to experience a normal event. One time I was sick. Once the company cut shifts. Once the car broke down just when the account was as thin as paper. And that's why you understand why people call it a shock trap. The scary part isn't about whether the shock is big or small. The scary part is that the system makes the shock more expensive for the poor. Expensive in the literal sense of money, but also expensive in the spiritual sense. You're sick. You're taking a day off. Taking time off work means lost income. Lost income, you're late. Late fees appear as a kind of tax for weakness. You requested support, but the support was delayed, and during that delay, the bills still arrived on time very professionally, very punctually, with no room for empathy. Rent doesn't slow down just because you're sick. Electricity isn't cheaper just because you cough, so you borrow. And when the final aid money finally arrives, it rarely opens the door to the future. It only helps you pay off a part of the past. If anything makes you poor like a full-time job, this is it. You're not just tired from making money. You're tired of constantly negotiating with life without a safety net and without a cushion. The shock is no longer a phase. It became a vicious cycle. Every time life gave a gentle nudge, you had to compensate by borrowing, delaying payments, and cutting back on a portion of your basic needs. The shock isn't just about money either. It's a change in housing, living conditions, and a prolonged sense of insecurity, especially when there are children in the home. A child who grows up in an environment where meals and bills are always a concern will learn to see the world through a very cold question. Will there be enough this week? And when the brain grows up in a state of alert, it carries that state into learning, into health, into the ability to believe that the future can be planned. And that's when we encounter the collapse of the class once considered the buffer zone of England. Middle England. In the past, Middle England was a buffer zone, not fairy tale rich, but stable enough to believe that, if I do the right thing, I'll be okay. Okay, here doesn't mean luxurious, just a predictable life. Pay the bills when they come, take a day off when the kids are sick, fix the car when it breaks down, and next month will still be next month, not a survival test. Now, many people still do it right. It's just that the word okay has changed its meaning, and no one sent out a notification. They're not necessarily hungry, but they started to get scared. Fearing energy bills is like fearing an absurd number suddenly jumping out of the darkness. Fearing interest rates is like fearing the weather uncontrollable but directly impactful. Afraid of car repairs, afraid of a call from school, afraid of a month's income shortfall. And when you live in fear of missing a month, you are no longer middle class in the traditional sense. You're just someone standing on a higher rung of the same ladder, a ladder whose lower rungs are rotting. What makes the problem even harder to solve is that Middle England often doesn't look poor. They still go to work, still paying in installments. There are still outward signs of stability. But on the inside, stability had been hollowed out. This is where measures like the Minimum Income Standard (MIS) make the story more uncomfortable. There are people who are not poor by income thresholds, but still do not reach a socially acceptable minimum standard of living. And then the trap that most infuriates Middle England appears. The threshold trap. You're not poor enough to get help, but also not stable enough to manage on your own. You're stuck in the grey area, not part of the group publicly sympathized with by society, but still bearing the brunt of rising costs as a kind of invisible discipline. This buffer zone itself also divides opinions. One side says, that's not poverty, it's just temporary difficulty. The other side said, when even those who were once stable are sweating over basic things. What's changing isn't the individual, it's the structure. Both sides hold a part of the truth. And the hard part is this. The structure can change the standard of living without any announcement, just by steadily increasing essential costs. While human tolerance, well, you're on your own. And so, Middle England began to experience the lives of the poor in a very specific, very real way. Bargain hunting, postponing medical appointments, reducing heating, counting every bill. They began moonlighting at an invisible job, the job of managing anxiety. If the baseline of life has been broken, what is crushing it the fastest silently, legally, and almost considered normal? We are often taught that poverty is a phase, a temporary detour, and that life will get back on track if you try hard enough. But when you look at how debt functions as part of the cost of survival, you'll see that poverty no longer looks like a detour. It's like a circle. You're borrowing to get through this month. Next month, you'll be living to pay for the previous month. And while you're trying not to fall, society still demands that you stand tall, smile, and call it self-reliance. What's noteworthy is that this isn't the story of a few unlucky individuals. It's the story of a system where the bare necessities housing, energy, food, transportation have become expenses capable of draining all efforts. When going to work no longer guarantees stability, people are forced to buy stability with their own future. And that's when a small event is enough to turn life into freefall. So, in your opinion, which is more dangerous? A society with poor people, or a society where the poor have to pay a higher fee just to live like normal people? And if a small shock can break the financial lives of millions, is the problem personal discipline, or is the foundation too thin? If you find this kind of analysis helpful, not sensationalized, not blaming, just trying to piece together data points into an understandable picture, please like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next part. This video aims to analyze social and economic factors based on publicly available sources and recorded experiences. It is not intended to attack or blame any individual or group. The figures may change depending on the timing of updates from statistical agencies and research organizations. Any real-life examples are for illustrative purposes only and do not represent the entire British population.